Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take a deep dive look at Edison format. We've already profiled Edison format on this channel, and we profiled a quick draw deck that would have been more authentic to what you would have seen in 2010. Today we're going to kind of thread the line a little bit here. I know when we talk about GOAT and Edison specifically, there's so much attention from the retro community that when you profile decks, you kind of need to make that disclaimer. Is this a actual 2010 deck profile, or is this a deck that you could see this weekend at an Edison tournament? Honestly, the deck that we're going to profile today, Gladiator Beast, and specifically this build, is pretty close to what you could have seen in 2010, but it is exactly the deck that I have in my Edison deck box that I would bring to an Edison event this weekend. So it is geared towards what I might anticipate seeing today as opposed to seeing 12 years ago. So that disclaimer is very important. Not that it's not necessarily representative, though, broadly of what a GB deck could have looked like all the way back in 2010. So I'm going to consider this authentic to 2010, but make that point of emphasis that you could very easily copy this deck and potentially see success this weekend. Before I actually get into the deck profile itself, I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine. Robbie is a player that I used to see on the YCS scene over 10 years ago. I had a great opportunity to meet back up with him at Nationals about a month or so ago. We played a bunch of Edison. He's actually the only person to beat me in a match of Edison that weekend, this particular deck that I'm profiling today. Saw a lot of success. I played against a bunch of different decks over the Nationals weekend. Played against Light Swarms, I played against Monarchs, I played against Frog builds, I played against Zombie decks, I played against a bunch of different decks, a GB mirror match actually. And he was the only person to beat me with one of his brews. So if you're really interested in Edison, I'll link his channel down below. He has a ton of deck profiles on there, a lot of rogue kind of interesting strategies. He told me he's got 50 plus different decks. So if you go take a look at his channel, you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. Now to the deck profile itself, this is the very first time we finally gotten to a point where I feel comfortable profiling a deck we've already profiled broadly on this channel. And I think as time goes on and we start to get up into 100 plus different deck profiles, it's going to become a little bit more frequent, right? A deck like GB's, for example, was obviously competitive in GB format, but then I could actually go back a little bit earlier before the release of Gyzarus and talk about the GB deck that Paul Levitin saw success with when Dad was at its peak. Or I could go even further into Yu-Gi-Oh! History and look at other iterations of Gladiator Beast, maybe like the ones that, for example, got second place against Cat Synchro at that Dark Strike Fighter Nationals. A deck like Black Wings and Glads and Lightsworn have been competitive for such long stretches of Yu-Gi-Oh! History. As of this point, I've tried to profile them only at one point in history, but as we go on, it's just an inevitability that we're going to profile decks multiple times. So this is the very first time we're going to kind of double dip, at least on an archetype. But before you turn the channel off, because we've already talked about GBs, it's really important to note GBs at Edison and GBs during GB format are two very different things. When we talk about Gladiator Beasts at their peak, when they were, I think without a doubt, the best deck, especially after Darkrom got watered down, we're talking about a deck with 3 Bestiari, 3 Solemn Judgment, 3 Cold Wave. I mean, these are 3 incredibly powerful cards that totally warped what that deck looked like. Well, now we're going to be talking about Gladiator Beast, where Bestiari is limited to 1, Cold Wave is limited to 1, Solemn Judgment is limited to 1. We now get to use cards like Gladiator Beast, Equeste, Samnite, and War Chariot, which were not out when Gladiator Beasts were at their peak. Even cards like Ready Ari, which are very important in this format when you have to worry about things like the zombie matchup. So the deck that we're going to profile today is vastly different than the deck we profiled at this point several months ago on this channel, and I think the functionality of these decks are just very different. The decks are going to look fundamentally different both on paper and actually how they play out. When you play this deck, you need to be very careful of getting your Bestiari banished. You can't just summon it into Bottomless Trap Hole without having a backup plan. Book of Moon, or a card of mine I'm going to talk about in a little bit, Shrink. You can't just let it sit there on the field if you don't have a way of playing around Caius, a very popular card in the format. You can't really just attack it into Deep Prison, because once you lose Bestiari, now all of a sudden you've lost access to Gyzarus, one of the most important pieces of your deck. Cards like Prisma, which I have in the deck, all of a sudden lose a ton of playability. What are you going to do? Just continually dump Laquaris without having that access to Gyzarus? So it has to be played in a very, very, very different way than when you could actually just play 3 Bestiaris and summon it into any back row at any point in the game, not really worry about it getting hit by Bottomless Trap Hole. So it's just fundamentally a very different deck, and it plays very differently. Now, I know those of you who whether play retro Edison or even modernized Edison know that Gladiator Beast is not necessarily considered tier 1, but it is a deck that I absolutely love playing. I love the style of the deck. It's got a lot of traps, a lot of defensive cards. It's a very tempo-heavy deck. It punishes slow starts. If you know how to kind of sequence things effectively and get all the value out of all the tag-outs with this deck, you can really grind an opponent down. I mean, there are some less than obvious plays about Mermilioing your own monsters so that you can Equest them back to your hand, and that way your Herc has more negates, or that you can sometimes send a Bestiari to the graveyard instead of bringing it back with Darius, bring it back with an Equest so that you can threaten the Bestiari set into Gyzarus on the following turn. A lot of intricacies about how to maximize the value with this deck, and it's a deck that I just absolutely enjoy playing. Today we're going to look at a deck that has both Rescue Cat and Prisma in it, which wasn't necessarily the most common thing in the world. I'm going to be playing Rescue Cat because it had access to Samnite, and I'm still going to be playing Prisma because I think this deck needs that explosiveness when you combine Prisma plus Test Tiger, or even just Prisma dumping a card like Laquari to the graveyard for value in future turns. That does make War Chariot a little bit of a liability, but I'll get all into that in the actual deck profile. Without further ado, let's take our second deep dive look at Edison, our second deep dive look at Gladiator Beasts, and take a look at a deck profile that is very similar to what you could see in 2010 and actually still play this weekend at your local tournament.
All right, first we'll start with 3 copies of Test Tiger. That goes without saying. Test Tiger is such a power play in this deck, obviously allowing you to tutor any Gladiator Beast that you need. Secutor, for example. It also combines really well with Rescue Cat. So, of course, 3 copies of Test Tiger. Then we have the Gladiator Beast. So we have 2 copies of Laquari, 2 copies of Darius, and 2 copies of Equeste for the multiples. Some people cut on copies of Darius and or Equeste. I think it's really important just to actually play the full 2 and 2. You want to be able to always search one of these. In order to generate consistent card advantage, you want to have multiple Equeste in your deck. There are actually many times you double Equeste. Equeste is not limited to once per turn. Obviously, Equeste can't search Equeste, but if you're resolving Secutor, particularly on multiple turns, you do have the ability oftentimes to get double Equeste off. Bringing back Chariot's amazing. Bringing back any Gladiator Beast is amazing. There's a play that you do with this deck sometimes where you Prisma the Bestiary to the graveyard, and then later on you just Equeste Bestiary to your hand instead of Darius it to the field, and then you set the Bestiary on the following turn and go into Gyzarus. That way, without giving your opponent the opportunity, to hit you with something like Bottom. Obviously, Bottomless will hit Gyzarus, but you just kind of save the Bestiary. You never actually expose the Bestiary to Bottomless Trample with that play. So I really like to do that play in this deck. So I think double Equeste is really important. You never want to run out of Equests. You don't want both to hit the graveyard. You never want to lose access to them. So you definitely need to play at least 2. Not 3, never 3, but you definitely need the 2. I don't think you can cut it to 1. Same thing with Darius. I think you need both Dariuses. You want to actually be able to summon double Darius sometimes off Secutor to go into just a full field of Gladiator Beasts, go into Herc, set yourself up for additional Gladiator Beast plays on the following turn. So I think 2 and 2 is really, really important. And double Laquari is just the biggest attack threshold. And it's also really important because it gives you something to ditch with Prisma. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to put Bestiary in the graveyard because it's limited to 1, and that shuts down your Prisma plays on the following turn. But you do want to put a Gladiator Beast in the graveyard with Prisma so that you can tutor it back to your hand with either tutor to your hand with Equeste or get it on the field with Darius. So having 2 is really important so that you can send them. Then we have 1 copy of Rediari. Rediari is just sort of the perfect Gladiator Beast to generate. I'm not going to use the word advantage in the same sense as card advantage, but just something, right? You want all your Gladiator Beast battle phases and tag outs to do something. And even just banishing a Goblin Zombie from your opponent's graveyard or starting to pick away dark monsters or light monsters or Lightsworn names. It's always great to just summon this if there's not another Gladiator Beast like Equeste or Darius that's going to obviously generate some type of advantage for you. You need the 1 copy of Myrmilio. You need, to me, 1 copy of Secutor. This is non-negotiable. Sometimes Gladiator Beast players cut this card because brick is a somewhat more modern term, but this is the equivalent of a brick just because it cannot tag out into other Gladiator Beasts, unlike Myrmilio and Rediari, which are not that great of draws. Obviously, you have the 1 copy of Bestiari. It is limited to 1. And then you have 1 copy of Samnite. Samnite is a really interesting Gladiator Beast because its effect in and of itself might appear underwhelming if it is on the field because it has been summoned through the effect of a Gladiator Beast. When it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can search your deck for a Gladiator Beast card, not just monster, so that allows you to actually tutor Gladiator Beast War Chariot to your hand. That effect on its own might seem underwhelming because you need to tag out into it to unlock that effect. And as a result, if you weren't playing Rescue Cat, which we'll talk about in just a moment, you usually wouldn't play Samnite. You would usually just rather have a monster with more attack like Laquari, or you just cut it all together, like you not play 3 Laquaris, but just not play it whatsoever. This is, to me, the most important non-Bestiari Gladiator Beast because what this card enables you to do is present situations to your opponent that put them into a bind, particularly because of the spell lineup. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but this is an amazing card allowing you to bluff. Its effect actually happens way more than you think. For example, if you... I'll even just show it to you because it's really just the crux of this deck. If you have Shrink and you tutor out Samnite, what is your opponent going to do? They want to attack you so that you can't just attack them and tag out into something like Bestiari. And most people will assume it could be something like Deep Prison and then it's just a 1-for-1 trade. But if they know you run Shrink, can they actually attack your Samnite? Chances are the answer to that is no, because if they attack into your Samnite, you get to tutor a War Chariot and you get to tag the Samnite out if you think that's necessary. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you'd rather just keep Samnite, but sometimes you tutor out a Secutor. Sometimes you tutor out an Equeste. It kind of depends on the game state. But it makes it really difficult for your opponent to ever attack, not just Samnite, but any Gladiator Beast, but especially Samnite, right? Attacking into an Equeste and allowing you to tag out is unfortunate, but it's not as game-breaking as Samnite, because Samnite is the only one that generates a specific and unique advantage when it destroys a monster by battle, unlike others that just generate advantage by tagging out. And even if you don't have Shrink, if your opponent knows that you're playing Shrink, can they afford to attack Samnite if they get blown up by Shrink? The answer to that might just be no. So it makes it so that you can bluff Shrink all the time if you just summon a Samnite off a Gladiator Beast and present a situation to your opponent where they get blown up by Shrink, even if you don't necessarily have it. And then it's just an amazing card to tutor out. And then maybe on the following turn, because I'm running Prisma, normal Prisma, send Bestiari, and now you Geyseris. Or maybe you just have Bestiari and you set it, and then Geyseris the opponent. So it's just an amazing tool because it is the only Gladiator Beast that allows you to bluff in that very particular way. Like, yeah, you can get Secutor, maybe bluff Wabaku, but Wabaku is not overwhelmingly common anyway in this deck. Samnite, though, allows you to present these situations that no other Gladiator Beast would enable you to do. Because if you just get Laquari, your opponent's not going to necessarily read Shrink. They might still attack into it, but Samnite is just that unique Gladiator Beast where the opponent's going to think to themselves, why did they go Samnite instead of Laquari, right? They're going to make that logical question. They're going to present that to themselves, and they're going to say, okay, that must mean they have Book of Moon, Shrink, or Enemy Controller. How do I play around those cards? And they might make a play that plays right around Shrink and Book of Moon and Enemy Controller, and all of a sudden they don't attack. And now on your turn, you can make the play of setting Bestiari, summoning Prisma, or any of those, or even just presenting it such that they don't even summon a monster because they're afraid that Samnite's going to attack over it because you have a card like Shrink, Book of Moon, or Enemy Control. So it just presents a situation to the opponent no other Gladiator Beast can do, and it's only a one-of. In worst case scenario, unlike Secutor, and then as would be the case with all the other Glads, you can just tag out. You can attack, tag out, get another Glad. And I've only elected to play one. Sometimes people who play Rescue Cat play more Samnites. Don't get me wrong, I love Samnite. It is, to me, the underappreciated and underutilized Gladiator Beast if you're playing this deck really to its full potential, for all the reasons that I just described. I don't think you often end up going Rescue Cat into double Samnite. Having Rescue Cat into double Samnite, having Test Tiger, I think, is just sufficient, right? One Rescue Cat into Samnite Test Tiger is a powerful play, right? That allows you to tutor any Glad in the deck. It allows you to go into Secutor, Bestiari, Myrmilio if you absolutely need it. It, to me, is powerful enough making that play. Even if your opponent has, let's say, no field whatsoever and going into double Samnite might allow you to do a double tag out, you can just tag out the Samnite into Secutor and then get 3 monsters on the field anyway. So I don't think you actually need 2 Samnites as much as I gave a glowing review on how important it is to this actual deck's integrity. So 1 Rescue Cat to combine with Samnite. You can technically get double Rescue Cat if you want, or double Test Tiger, but that doesn't happen very often. Usually you just get Samnite, Test Tiger, and make a power play. And then, as I alluded to when talking about sending Bestiari and sending Laquari and making some of those Samnite bluffs, you have 2 copies of Prisma. What's an interesting thing about Prisma is because we're playing War Chariot, unlike the original Gladiator Beast deck that we profiled on this channel, there is some degree of liability in normal summoning Prisma and then passing to the opponent because it locks you out of using War Chariot, because although Prisma copies the name of a Glad on your turn, it doesn't follow to the opponent's turn. So if you open Prisma and War Chariot, it's kind of a nombo. You can't actually set War Chariot and expect to use it. I mean, you can set it and then hope on the next turn that you can use Prisma and then go maybe buy Geyseris, maybe pop a Goblin Zombie and use War Chariot there. But you can't just use it on a Deep Sea Diva, for example, or a Quick Draw effect, or any of the other types of effects that you might anticipate seeing Lone Fire Blossom. So you do need to keep that in the back of your mind that Prisma, because this is a War Chariot version, right, we're actually past the Duelist Genesis with the release of Synchro Monsters. War Chariot's now out, unlike the very first time we profiled Gladiator Beasts. There is something you need to keep in the back of your mind. That's also why I've cut Stratos. For a little while, I played Stratos in this deck, but the situation of having War Chariot and that confliction, it happened too often, and it really actually compounds if you have War Chariot and Stratos, because then you have to search Prisma, and then that's another non-Gladiator Beast, and all of a sudden the War Chariot can be stranded in your hand for quite a bit longer than you really want. So I've elected only to play 2 Prismas. I think Prisma is a really important piece to the Gladiator Beast strategy. It gives it the explosiveness, right? For those of you who aren't familiar, Prisma Test Tiger allows you to send a Bestiari to the grave, tutor out a Darius, and then immediately go into Geyseris, which is your ability to destroy 2 cards on the field, tutor out more Gladiator Beast, generates Hearts of Card advantage. So to me, having those explosive plays is really important, right? You can just nickel and dime your way through a match, but having the ability to make those really explosive plays is really important. You know, with this deck, as is the case with a lot of these style of decks during this time period, to me, I like to nickel and dime with the original Gladiator Beasts, and then once I've kind of whittled my opponent's resources down, or I think I have pretty good reads on their back rows, then that's when I like to do something like Prisma Test Tiger, when I'm more confident that it goes through, which is something that I think is really important. I think you need to have cards like Prisma and Rescue Cat in this deck. I don't think playing Rescue Cat's that big of a deal. Just playing one Samnite, and I think Samnite's really important anyway. Some people don't even play Rescue Cat. I don't know why. Prisma, I can understand not playing Prisma because of the conflict with War Chair, but I really think you need that explosiveness. So that is my current monster lineup. For spells, I already previewed Shrink. Shrink, I think, is actually just the best defensive card in this deck. This deck has one sort of elephant in the room issue, and it was the release of Stardust Dragon. You know, the Duelist Genesis is a fascinating pack. It was released right after Gladiator Beast format, when Gladiator Beast took down Nationals, when Gladiator Beast was by far the most dominant deck, competing with the watered-down versions of Down Return. When the Duelist Genesis came out, it was also on the eve of a new ban list, and that new ban list did not touch in any way, shape, or form Gladiator Beasts. And it was shocking to people. Bestiari remained at 3, Cold Wave remained at 3, all of these really unbelievable cards in the Gladiator Beast deck remained at 3, and they got new cards. They got Samnite, and they got Gladiator Beast War Chariot in the Duelist Genesis, and the deck just wasn't touched, and it really perplexed players who had yet to really sit down and play with some of the new cards. However, Teledad was able to run rampant that format, even though Gladiator Beasts were better than they were in the previous format, at least on paper, sort of in isolation of the format. And it was largely due to the release of Synchro Monsters, specifically Stardust Dragon. You know, Stardust Dragon is a really difficult card for this deck to deal with, because if the opponent's not willing to attack into a deep prison, you know, what are you going to do? You can't Remelio it. You can't really attack into it, at least without a card like this. And even if you do attack it by putting it in defense with something like Book of Moon, and you tag in a Remelio, they just negate with Stardust, right? Kaizeris, negate with Stardust. Everything just gets negated by Stardust. Bestiary, negate by Stardust. So it's really difficult. Even if you have something like War Chariot, it kind of takes you 3 or 4 pieces to really make a good play there. One thing you can do if you ever get it off, though, is summon off a Secutor, right? If you Book of Moon a Gladiator, Book of Moon their Stardust, and you time the effects of your Gladiator Beasts off a Secutor, and you make Mermelio Chainlink 1, and then let's say a Quest Chainlink 2, you can actually destroy a Stardust in that situation, because you can't Stardust negate into Quest, and then Mermelio will resolve Chainlink 1. So there is, you know, some play that you can make in and around that, but that requires you to have a lot of tools like Book of Moon. Well, Shrink actually just solves that problem. Basically, every single Gladiator Beast minus a handful, Mermelio, Rediari, but all the others, Secutor too, but all of the other bigger ones, right? Samnite, Quest, Laquari, Darius, you can just even, but Bestiari, you can just shrink the Stardust Dragon in damage step. So it allows you to be offensive. It's essentially a smashing ground that doesn't just get negated by Stardust Dragon, a card that some of these decks actually ended up playing. Plus, you said it, it's just an unbelievable card because it serves there as a Sakuratsu armor, or if we're going to use the cards at this point in time, almost like a Deep Prison-like effect or a Mirror Force-like effect, where they run into one of your creatures and you just kill it. But the thing is, with this deck, it combines so well with Gladiator Beasts because now that triggers Gladiator Beasts. And I just talked to you about the Samnite. 1, the ability to bluff with Samnite once your opponent knows you're running this, or 2, just actually combine it with Samnite. You know, sometimes you just have the card, and sometimes your opponent just has to attack anyway, and you end up using Shrink in the damage step. Your Samnite resolves, searching a card, end of the battle phase, you send it out, you get Bestiari, you pop something else. And what is so amazing about this card, we have already, in my opinion, said enough to make Shrink an important piece in Gladiator Beasts. One of the things you need to keep in the back of your mind when you're playing this particular deck is, it's not impossible, but it's inconvenient when Bestiari is banished. Super inconvenient. So don't attack into Deep Prison, right? If you have, they could potentially have Deep Prison, I will almost never attack with Bestiari. The other card, though, that is in almost every single deck, and it's even in this deck, and we'll talk about it now. For those of you that play Edison, you probably know Bottomless is a very, very common trap card. Most, not all, but most decks that have a reasonable trap lineup will play Bottomless. Bottomless Trap Hole is obviously a nightmare for Bestiari. It just hits the 1500 threshold, and if you summon Bestiari into a Bottomless, even if you pop another back row, like a Black Whirlwind, for example, you get this banish, now you're locked out of Kaizeris. There's no way of getting it out of the banish pile besides cards like Return. No one's going to play Return just to get a Bestiari out of the banish pile, assuming that it gets there in the first place. So you have to be incredibly protective of your Bestiari. I'm talking about setting it. For those of you who didn't play back then, you know, you can have, for example, any Gladiator Beast. I just have Secutor here, and you can set Bestiari and then contact into Kaizeris that way to safely put it into the deck. There are ways of kind of playing around the reality that your opponent could have the very common Bottomless Trap Hole. But with Shrink, you can actually more recklessly just summon Bestiari. Now, I'm never going to attack into a deep prison with it, but you can summon it because if your opponent uses Bottomless Trap Hole, if you change Shrink, all of a sudden this doesn't have 1500 attack anymore. It has 750, and it will make the Bottomless Trap Hole fizzle, right? Bottomless doesn't target in any way. It would banish multiple monsters if they're summoned, so it kind of checks at resolution what are the monsters that have been summoned with 1500 or more attack. That's why it would hit both Airbellums off a Rescue Cat. Well, at resolution, this has 750 attack, and as a result, this plays around Bottomless Trap Hole. Shrink, in many ways, is almost the equivalent of a card like Forbidden Lance, which was not out at this time, but probably would be played. It allows you to attack over big monsters, especially Stardust Dragon, which is a huge concern. It allows you to bluff with Samnite, which is incredibly important if you want to play this deck really to its full potential. It allows you just to use Samnite effectively. It allows you to attack over big creatures like Stardust, like I alluded to, but also defend against attacks from big creatures when you hit in them in the damage step, and then trigger cards during the end of the battle phase, the Gladiator Beast effects. And if that wasn't enough, it allows you to dodge Bottomless. And it even allows you to dodge Bottomless on other creatures in your deck like Gyzarus. And if you summon Gyzarus and pop 2 monsters and they go activate Bottomless, you can go Shrink Gyzarus, it goes to 12, and now I can attack, tag out. Absolutely unbelievable. This is a card that I honestly kind of laughed at in terms of seeing it in deck list, and then I tried it and I realized that this is easily the best card in Gladiator Beast. I would play this card before I played Bottomless Trap Hole, to be brutally honest with you. Shrink is just so critically important. I tried 1 and then I bumped it to 2, and I'm absolutely on 3. It is unbelievable in this deck. Next, 3 Book of Moon. Again, Stardust Dragon is a problem. Shrink is part of the way we deal with it. Book of Moon is the other. So having 3 Book of Moons is really important. It's just so versatile, right? You hit tuners when they're trying to synchro. You do so many great things with Book of Moon. Allows you to attack over big monsters. There's, tons have already been said about Book of Moon throughout the year. So Book of Moon, no doubt, 3 of, easy inclusion. The back row removal, MST and heavy. And then there is 1 Cold Wave in this format. It is limited to 1. This deck does really well with Cold Wave. The original combo when Gladiator Beast was at its absolute peak in terms of at least its popularity, and probably even its peak in terms of playability when it was Gladiator Beast format, is Cold Wave, Prisma, Test Tagger, right? You do that Darius play that I alluded to, you pop 2 back rows, you tag out, they're under Cold Wave, they can't set new back rows, they basically lose the game. We can technically do that occasionally. It's right, a card may not searching, so you kind of have to naturally drop it. Gladiator Beasts function really well with this, because then you can more freely Bestiari. If you don't already have Shrink to protect from Bottomless, you can pop back rows, set yourself up for the next turn. So Cold Wave, even though we're not doing Prisma, Test Tiger as commonly, I mean, we might be doing it reasonably, but we're not doing it with Cold Wave as much. We still want to have that Cold Wave. And then there's 1 copy of Rhoda. You could probably consider other cards over this. I like Rhoda because you can kind of set it as a bluff, but it also allows you to basically play a 3rd Prisma. And Prisma goes back into the deck when you use Test Tiger, so you don't have to really worry about the idea, wait, you only have 2 warriors with Rhoda? But once I cut Stratos, I could understand also cutting Rhoda, but it is what I have there right now. Maybe you could play something like an enemy controller as an additional defensive card, but this is currently what I have, a copy of Reinforcements of the Army. So what I have for the trap lineup. So I have the full 3 copies of Chariot. You can tutor it through Samnite, and that happens way more than you think, particularly in the way that I try to play this deck. Like, I actually do try to summon Samnite a lot, even without Shrink. The 3 copies of War Chariot, it is an unbelievable card. It's one of your outs to Stardust Dragon if you particularly construct your chains the way I alluded to earlier. It allows you just to loop it with Equeste and make it so that your opponent has to deal with a monster negation every turn, which can be really difficult. It's not at a point where every deck has a ton of extenders, so 3 War Chariot, absolute inclusion. This plus Herc is almost unbeatable if you have a big enough hand, which is another reason you need to play double Equeste. You need to just put random Gladiator Beasts into your hand when you have Herc on the field. There's actually a play that happens sometimes where you use Secutor and you actually summon Myrmilio off a Secutor to pop a Gladiator Beast on the field and then bring a Quest out also, so that you can start to replenish cards in your hand and just consistently have a lot of cards in hand with Herc. Because if you're looping with War Chariot, you want to have a lot of cards in hand because you have the Monster Negate covered, and then you just want to negate their spell and traps with Herc. So 3 War Chariot, double Bottomless basically in every single deck. I do have double Deep Prison. I was actually back and forth on Deep Prison. It is an out to Stardust Dragon. I kind of described that I think Stardust Dragon isn't as big of a deal because of the Shrinks. Maybe against this deck you summon Thought Ruler more, by the way. But double Deep Prison. This is a little controversial. With playing this deck and playing the format, and you worry about cards like Icarus Attack, Judgment Dragon, Celestial, Gyzarus in the mirror match, obviously Heavy Storm, Torrential. I think Starlight Road is actually pretty good. And I understand having 2 copies, you might think to yourself, well, that card's going to be dead a lot. It can be. I really know that it can be. But being able to set your back rows without having to worry about Heavy Storm is just such a huge play in this deck. And there are plenty of other really powerful cards in the format that Starlight Road hits. It is a card that's easy to read when the game goes on, right? What's that back row that's been sitting there forever? Have they ever had a chance to Starlight Road? Nope. Okay, it's probably Starlight Road. So in a long game, your opponent will probably eventually be able to read this, but even if they know it's there, it still locks them out of using the cards like Torrential, Icarus, Judgment Dragon Effect, Celestial, Geyserus Effect, right? So I like having Starlight Road. There's also other the one-ups. Judgment's limited to one, so we just play the one. Torrential Tribute, Drop Dust Shoot, which is, just a ridiculously powerful card. And then Call of the Haunted. So Call of the Haunted has a couple purposes in this deck. You can never, ever, ever get SDRE banished, right? I've already commented on that. One of the things that's almost, it's not impossible, but it's very, 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 very difficult to play around is DD Crow on SDRE, right? If you do Prisma Test Tiger, like I was alluding to earlier, even if you have War Chariot, it can be difficult to get that to fully resolve, right? When they have DD Crow, you want to make sure you have War Chariot. You want to make sure you have ways to avoid DD Crow, or else they DD Crow on your Bestiari, and then you can't get it back. Call of the Haunted at least gives you a play where you can Call of the Haunted the Bestiari. That matters a little bit more in games 2 and 3 when it's more conceivable that they could side in DD Crow, especially if they see you playing Prisma. I actually would recommend siding DD Crow against this deck if you see that they're playing Prisma. Because unlike original GBs, where you would actually just still play DD Crow, the original GB deck actually mained Crow, sometimes even 3 copies to play around the Darius play. When you use DD Crow against Darius at this point in time, not only are you stopping the Geyserus play, you're potentially banishing the only, well, it would be the only Bestiari, but if it resolved, you're banishing the only Bestiari. So I like having a card like Call of the Haunted because it starts to hedge against some of the side decking that you would have to do, where you have to be very conservative about putting Bestiari in the graveyard. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind. So it allows you to do that. And then in games 2 and 3, try your best to set it up so that you always have a Glad plus Chariot on board when you get Bestiari in the grave so that you can play around DD Crow. But Call of the Haunted allows you to do that. It's also just a pretty reasonable card. It combines really well with Prisma. It also combines with Rescue Cat pretty well. It allows you to bring back a Test Tiger. It is one of the ways to revive a Glad that got to the grave who's not in rotation. So technically you can do Darius to get Myrmelio, Secutor, Rediari back in rotation. Call is just another way of doing that. And this deck doesn't obviously have a lot of extenders. It has basically no extenders by the definition of the word extender. So Call of the Haunted serves a purpose there where if you can, push through a play and Call of the Haunted, right? Your opponent might not be setting all their back rows because Heavy Storm is legal. Call of the Haunted is just a great way to make an additional play after they stop your first play. And it combines really well with Prisma, like I mentioned, right? You can Prisma, send Bestiari, Call of the Haunted Bestiari, and that can go off really well for you. In terms of the extra deck, you should probably have 15. You do have 15 cards. I don't actually have 15 right here, but you should put 15. These are the ones you need. From this point on, you can just put whatever cards your heart desires. You need Chimera Tech. You probably don't need 3. You only really need 2. Honestly, actually, you do need 3. I'm going to change that. Your opponent could make the mistake of putting Cyber Dragon plus Machine on the field, so you would actually then want to have a Chimera Tech there, plus you side 2 Chimera Tech. So boom, there's your 3 copies. You need to have 3 copies. You need to have 3 copies of Geyserus. That's non-negotiable. I actually technically only own 2 copies of Harak. So you'd want to put a 3rd copy there. And you need 2 because you're running 2 Starlight Roads. So you need 2 Stardust. I don't have access to tuners in my deck. I don't play Brain Control. So at this point, you can just put whatever cards you want. Put a Colossal Fighter, Thought Ruler, whatever extra deck cards you want. These are the ones you absolutely need. I don't play Sangan, or else I would put it there because of Prisma. I don't play Spirit Reaper anywhere. I don't play Dark Panther. That card's kind of antiquated at this point because of the release of Samnite. So I don't have any other Gladiator Beasts necessary cards. I don't have any Prisma targets. So those are the only ones. Do know you can actually Prisma for this. That actually can matter against machine decks. So what do I have here? So what are the decks you could expect to play against? This is a really difficult question because, original Edison versus modern Edison are very different. People run such unusual, unique decks now, and it's kind of hard. Like, look at the pile of cards I have here, and I could have probably kept going based on some of the decks that I've seen over the years. So I have a pile that's, I'd say, the balance between modern Edison and old Edison. So you can maybe see Gladiator Beasts. Zombies are incredibly popular. Diva Zombies, maybe Krebon versions, other versions of Zombies. Monarchs, Frog Monarchs is a deck that you could occasionally still see. Actual just like Frog Control with a few Monarchs here or there, like Hyas and Ryza, for example, is actually a pretty good deck. Frog cards themselves, even before Ronin Totem, are actually pretty broken. So having just a Frog deck is something that you can anticipate playing against. There's obviously Machina Gadgets. X-Sabers are okay. There's Cat Synchro, which is okay, was okay. There's obviously Gladiator beats Nemesis, Blackwings. This was always a difficult matchup because of the attack thresholds and cards like Colute. Icarus attack can be really annoying, which is another reason I'm playing multiple Starlight Roads. But there was original, just natural Blackwings, and Oppression is usually in that deck, which is really difficult to deal with. There's sort of the Vayu Turbo version of that, which can sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes play Lightsworn. Sometimes there's like a Lightsworn Vayu Turbo deck. Actual just Lightsworns was a deck. Even like Twilight was a deck. There's potentially Gravekeeper decks. They got Descendant as a new release. They didn't have Recruiter yet, though. This deck's not super popular in Modern, but at the time, Flamebell Monarchs was a deck. There's sort of an absolute zero deck that people could play, whether it's Modern, occasionally in Retro, maybe sometimes with zombies. Hero Beat, to an extent, could potentially see play. Fish is more of a Modern take on Edison, but there's a cool OTK with Fish. There's obviously sort of the Jeff Jones Quick Draw decks. This is definitely a Modern one. There's a sort of a Lyris deck that's ridiculous. Sometimes it plays dragons. That deck's pretty crazy with Phantom of Chaos. There was sort of dragon turbo decks at the time. At the time, people actually combined a lot with Exodia. And there are more decks. There's like a Plant Burn deck. There's Volcanic. I don't necessarily have reflected here. Maybe you can do that with Quick Draw because that's often combined with Quick Draw. Literally, I could just cover my whole mat with decks. This is, I think, is a good enough representation of Edison. How are we combating it? Well, we have double Cyber Dragon. Honestly, to an extent, to combat the opponent's Cyber Dragons, because even if you're going first, you should probably side Cyber against GBs because of the attack threshold of Cyber Dragon, and then you want your own to counteract it to go into Chimera Tech. Plus, it's obviously good against a bunch of other decks on here. It's good against machine-based decks just by default, but it's good against other decks on here as well. We have 2 copies of DD Crow. DD Crow is some of the only resistance you have against some of the really crazy combo decks. It's actually good against GBs, like I alluded to. It can be good against some of the other strategies. Maybe Vayu, maybe Lightsworn. Kind of depends on your mood there. Maybe Frogs. Kind of depends on your mood. Probably Zombies. I have 2 copies of D-Fissure. You might be able to bump this up to 3 if you find the room. It's just an amazing card against a lot of the strategies, right? Against Frogs, this card can be pretty good, particularly going first. Against Zombies, right? You can just activate this, attack over a Goblin Zombie, and they're really far behind. So it has a lot of utility there. It's good against plant-based decks too, right? That deck wants to Pot Avarice a bunch, and if you can't put monsters in the grave, you're not using Pot Avarice. I have 1 copy of My Body as a Shield. My Body as a Shield is just a really good card. I don't really want it to clunk, but it's similar to a degree like Shrink, though it counteracts some different cards, right? It's good against Icarus. It's really good against things like, obviously things like Torrential Tribute, but it actually can stop Judgment Dragon, it can stop Geyseris, it can stop some really powerful effects. So I love cards like My Body as a Shield because it can be used proactively by, just pushing yourself into back rows, hitting bottomless with this, saving Bestiari can be really good, or it can be used somewhat defensively depending on the matchup. I have 3 copies of Mask Restrict. I know it shuts down your Rescue Cat plays, or your Test Tiger plays, but it's really good against, obviously, the Monarch-based strategies, the Frog-based strategies. The decks that get shut down by this literally can't beat this at all, so I like having a card like this. Same thing with Light Imprisoning Mirror. 3 might be a lot, but Lightsworns can be an annoying matchup. It's not unwinnable, but it can be just annoying. And it's annoying to lose to Lightsworns because particularly at this point in time, it kind of feels like they have to get lucky to win, just the way the deck is run, with only 1 copy of cards like Charge of Light Brigade. And having a card like Light Imprisoning Mirror gives you kind of a blowout card, and particularly when you're protecting it with Herc, it can be really hard basically impossible at that point for your opponent to beat you. And then 2 copies of Trap Stun. This is my counterplay to cards like Royal Oppression, particularly out of the Vayu Turbo deck. Obviously, for those of you who play, you know that Vayu can be used under Royal Oppression, or at least your opponent can't negate it because it doesn't banish its cost, and they can just keep activating it. Everyone has to make that mistake once. But if you're playing against that deck, if you Trap Stun and leave them with Oppression on the field, or you just kill it outright, let's say you think you're going to keep Special Summoning, you could use Trap Stun to keep their Royal Oppression on the field if you thought that was a way of winning, because then they can't summon Dark Arm. If they're playing Blizzard, that shuts that off too. It shuts off a lot of what that deck can do. It can still summon under Vayu, but it could shut them off enough, or you just destroy it with Geyseris. I really like Trap Stun because it also can, depending on what they tribute, it can either just sort of, I'm going to say 1-for-1 with Icarus. I know Icarus tributes, so it is technically a 2-for-1, but usually they're tributing off something summoned off Blizzard, or a card that's a pseudo floater, or a card they searched off Ashura. So it can sort of 1-for-1, if not even sometimes +1 Trap Stun. Any of these trap-based strategies, I just really love Trap Stun. Right, the games go long enough where you can set this card up. The only hand trap in the format you really have to worry about with this deck is DD Crow, right? Veiler's not out yet. You don't have to worry about anything else. So as long as you can get a Gyzeris to go off under Trap Stun, you're going to be in really good shape. And it's kind of the second and third copy of Cold Wave-like effects. But that, without further ado, is my current Edison Gladiator Beast deck. I really enjoy Gladiator Beast, really love Gladiator Beasts. It's by far, far, far from the most popular deck, but it's a deck I love, and I love playing. But anyway, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.